The Sparrow, a novel of faith and first contact by Mary Doria Russell. Matthew 10, verse 29. Not one sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it, but the sparrow still falls. Let's begin with an overview of the story. The Sparrow is a story about a team of 8 people who set out to make contact with the first intelligent life detected outside of Earth, identified by transmissions of music from a planet that comes to be known as Rakat. The mission to Rakat is sponsored by the Jesuits, but includes others whose skills are crucial to the success of the team. The book follows the development of the mission, its initial success and eventual failure, and the fallout for the only surviving member who makes it back to Earth, Father Emilio Sandoz. The narrative switches backwards and forwards in time, but the main emphasis of this presentation is on the main storyline of the mission itself. Here is a prologue from the book. It was predictable, in hindsight. Everything about the history of the Society of Jesus bespoke deft and efficient action, exploration, and research. During what Europeans were pleased to call the Age of Discovery, Jesuit priests were never more than a year or two behind the men who made initial contact with previously unknown peoples. Indeed, Jesuits were often the vanguard of exploration. The United Nations required years to come to a decision that the Society of Jesus reached in 10 days. In New York, diplomats debated long and hard with many recesses and tablings of the issue, whether and why human resources should be expended in an attempt to contact the world that would become known as Rakat, when there were so many pressing needs on Earth. In Rome, the questions were not whether or why, but how soon the mission could be attempted and whom to send. The Society asked no leave of any temporal government. It acted on its own principles, with its own assets, on papal authority. The mission to Rakat was undertaken not so much secretly as privately. A fine distinction, but one that the Society felt no compulsion to explain or justify when the news broke several years later. The Jesuit scientists went to learn, not to proselytize. They went so that they might come to know and love God's other children. They went for the reason Jesuits have always gone to the farthest frontiers of human exploration. They went ad majorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God. They meant no harm. A cast of characters. Father Emilio Sandoz grew up in La Perla, a slum of San Juan, Puerto Rico. He was an illegitimate son, always at odds with the man he believed to be his father. Parish priest Father D.W. Yarbrough spotted his potential and made it possible for him to go to school, where he eventually excelled in languages. Although he never felt a deep emotional, personal connection to God, he wanted to be like the Jesuits he admired, and so he joined the order. Instead of the prestigious teaching position he deserved, he was moved from one remote Jesuit mission to another, always learning new languages, improvising in harsh climates, and seeing the terrible things human beings do to one another. Dr. Ann Edwards and Mr. George Edwards. Ann and George met Emilio when he arrives in Cleveland to have his linguistic skills programmed into an artificial intelligence. The Edwards have no children, and they begin to forge the deep bonds of family with Emilio. When he's offered the chance to return to the parish in La Perla, he convinces them to come along. Ann runs the neighborhood clinic, and George volunteers at the Arecibo Radio Telescope. Sofia Mendez grew up in Istanbul, surrounded by, quote, books and music and love of learning, end quote. When she was 14, her mother was killed by a mortar shell, and her father disappeared one day after leaving the house to search for food. Left with no resources in a war zone, Sofia turned to prostitution to survive. She was later picked up by a futures broker, a man who provides means and education to intelligent young people in exchange for a percentage of their lifetime earnings. A career of indentured servitude. With a capacity for mathematics and computers, Sofia becomes a sought-after developer, whose main skill is automating the jobs normally done by other skilled workers. Her cultural memory of what happened to her people when they were expelled from Spain in 1492 colors her interactions with the very Spanish Father Emilio, and reminds readers that the implications of religious conflict persist long into the future. Jimmy Quinn is an astronomer at the Arecibo radio telescope. His job is about to be programmed and automated by Sofia Mendez. In an attempt to save his job, he proposes a challenge. He will give Sofia all the information she needs to create the AI program, and then it will run side by side against him for 2 years to see whether man or machine is superior. His bosses accept the proposal, and Sofia comes to begin writing the program. 3 more Jesuits round out the mission to Racat. D.W. Yarbrough was a former parish priest in La Perla and current provincial in New Orleans. He's assigned full command over the mission. Alan Pace is a musician whose skills are crucial to the mission since humanity's first received transmission was music from the unknown planet. Mark Rubischow is a naturalist and watercolorist who manages the plants and fish used as food sources on the journey to Racat, and also helps determine what is edible and inedible once the team arrives on the planet. A timeline of the story. 2019, Puerto Rico, Jimmy Quinn picks up a broadcast of interstellar music at the Arecibo radio telescope. An excerpt from the book. "What do we do now?" Jimmy asked. It was Emilio Sandoz, face solemn and eyes alight, who answered him. "Start planning the mission," he said. There was silence, and then Anne laughed uncertainly. "Emilio, sometimes I can't tell when you're joking. Do you mean a mission, or do you mean a mission? Are we talking science or religion?" "Yes," he said simply, with a kind of hilarious gravity that kept the rest of them off balance. 2021 to 2039, Journey to Alpha Centauri. Although it takes roughly 17 Earth years, the team is traveling almost at the speed of light and experiences the trip taking only 6 or 7 months. After a while, it became hard to ignore how, against odds, the dice kept coming up in favor of the mission. The crew members went on with their training, their work unaffected by the waxing and waning of confidence, but they all experienced varying degrees of amazement. Even the Jesuits were divided. Mark Rubischow and Emilio Sandoz smiled and said, "See? Deus Vult." Reviewer Brandon G. Withrow notes that Deus Vult, or God wills it, is a common theme throughout the book. If God wills the good, does God also will the bad? Those of us in this class will hear immediately the echo of Deus Vult as the people's response to Pope Urban II's announcement of the First Crusade. 2039, Landing and First Contact. The team argues about whether to go directly to the city from which the music is transmitted or adjust to the planet in a rural area first. Alan Pace wanted to make contact with the city inhabitants immediately and directly. The musical communication could be drawn on at the very beginning, just as we used music to make contact with the Guarnari in the 18th century. Also, there are the precedents of Xavier and Ricci, who determined to go as quickly as possible to the cities of Japan and China and worked with the educated classes first. 2040 to 2043. The team lands in a rural area and makes contact first with the Ruano, peaceful vegetarian gatherers who support themselves through trade. Later, they encounter the urban Janaata. Despite their careful efforts and initial success, the mission eventually goes horribly wrong. The mission to Racat turned into a nightmare, as the goodwill and guiltless cultural blindness of the Earth team led to a deadly misunderstanding. When harm results from this inability to assess a culture from the threshold of exploration, the shockwaves become literally intergalactic. From a review of the book. I highly recommend this book, and will attempt to finish the presentation by giving enough information to draw comparisons between this mission and past missions, but without completely giving away the plot of the story. 2060, Naples. Having finally returned alone, the sole survivor, Emilio recovers both physically and spiritually as his fellow Jesuits try to untangle what happened on the planet. The Jesuit Father General, Vincenzo Giuliani, sat at his desk and fingered a stylus. There was the question of what to do next regarding Racat, and he did feel the need to bring Emilio to some sort of resolution. This wasn't the first time the Jesuits had encountered an alien culture, and it wasn't the first mission to come to grief, and Sandoz wasn't the first priest to disgrace himself. The whole business was regrettable, but not beyond redemption. He's salvageable, Giuliani thought stubbornly. And what right do we have to declare the mission a failure? Seeds may have been sown. God knows. As we consider the mission, we see that it was a double-edged sword, both done well and done poorly. The mission to Rakat was always a mixed bag. The team went as explorers with the goal of establishing peaceful contact. No mention was ever made of proselytizing. They took skilled leaders, a doctor, an engineer, an astronomer, a computer programmer, a naturalist, and a linguist. They were prepared to observe and learn and approach the planet's inhabitants seemingly without an agenda. They adapted and interacted peacefully. At the same time, the lack of intention to proselytize was not replaced with a clear intention of what they would do. The mission seems only to go and make contact. While this is a noble intellectual endeavor, the lack of a solid plan, or at least a clear intent, keeps the explorers from making clear-headed decisions about how to proceed. They could not actually articulate their mission. They also made too many assumptions about gender roles, food, culture, tradition. They failed to calculate how their presence and their interference would upset the power balance. In fairness, they had no way to know which questions they should ask, and it never occurred to the inhabitants to explain things that were so ingrained into their culture. Now we consider culture and mission. By updating the missionary stories of the past, Russell focuses the reader's attention on questions about the nature of missionary work, whether it is conducted by explorers, scientists, business people, or religious. What does it mean to encounter people at least superficially so different from ourselves? What does missionary experience do to our prejudices, desires, and cultural expectations? And now we move into a section of the presentation exploring the interactions between culture and mission in the book, and perhaps how we see echoes of past missions. Species and culture. The explorers were prepared to meet different cultures, but were unprepared to meet different species. They first met the rural Ruano and correctly assumed that the beings who lived in the cities would have different values. Because Earth only has one type of sentient beings, humans, the explorers were unprepared for how the difference in species would compound the difference in culture. Unlike colonizers, they did not assume that their own human culture was superior, but tried to understand the different values they found. Borders and property. The notion of borders and who owns what inside them is significant, both in the missions to Central and South America and also to Rakat. As we saw in the movie The Mission, territory was staked and claimed on behalf of Spain and Portugal, supposedly giving those monarchs quote-unquote rights to the people and resources found within, regardless of where the native people felt the borders lay. On Rakat, the Runa do not understand these types of boundaries, as Emilio explains in chapter 22. Furthermore, they have no concept of boundaries, such as our separate nations. They speak in terms of what a geographic region contains, a flour for making this distillation, or an herb which is good for that dye. Eventually, I came to understand that the Runa do not have vocabulary for the edges that we perceive separating one element from another. This reflects their social structure and their perceptions of the physical world, and even their political status. The Jana'ata, however, understand boundaries and property rights based on their trading agreements. The Jana'ata male, named Supa'ari, has exclusive trading rights with the Varakani tribe, and therefore controls everything that happens to them. The explorers do not understand this in time to stop a tragedy from happening. Technology. The Earth explorers understand that their technology would confound the inhabitants of Rakat and could affect the power balance. What they did not anticipate was that it was not their own conception of technology, their computers and space travel, but their simpler technical advances, such as food gardens, that would cause the biggest problems. Like horses brought from Europe to the Americas, something so seemingly mundane had huge implications. Balance of power. A delicate balance of power exists on Rakat, so ingrained and nuanced that the explorers do not understand it until it is too late. The Runa provide the raw materials necessary for Jana'ata production and commerce. But the Jana'ata are vicious and can usually control the Runa when necessary with a small enforcement team. When the explorers reveal to the Runa that they are many and the enforcers are few, they open a path for resistance, hostility, and rebellion. A principle well understood on Earth is novel and shattering on Rakat. Food sources. As the sharing of certain crops shaped the cultures of Europe and America, the introduction of food gardens sets off a chain of events that will ultimately destroy the mission. Food is a necessity for all living beings, and yet we often fail to consider how changing the food can, in fact, change a culture. It changes the actual physiognomy of human beings, changing their options for how and where to live. The simple addition or subtraction of a specific food has huge implications. The rural Runa are vegetarians, who seem unreasonably upset by the sight or smell of meat. The urban Jana'ata are carnivores who require a particular type of meat to survive. Providing the Runa with the means to garden their own food keeps them from having to go and gather their less nutritious food sources. The extra fat and nutrients make them more fertile, and the birth of many babies at one time upsets the power balance with the Jana'ata. Gender roles in reproduction. The explorers assume that family systems on Rakat mirror family systems on Earth. Indeed, they proceed for several years under the delusion that males and females are the exact opposite. Female Runa are taller and stronger, the merchants and war heirs. Male Runa are smaller, more dexterous and nurturing, building specialty items, managing households, and caring for children. Male Jana'ata, however, are as large as female Runa and handle the commerce. Female Jana'ata are secluded and rarely seen, reserved mainly for their special breeding purposes. The explorers' failure to question their own assumptions keeps them from seeing the potential impact of their seemingly innocuous actions. Commerce. Failing to understand how the system of commerce works, the explorers endangered not only their new friends, but their own mission as well. They give away things that are valuable, almost cut the Varakani tribe out of transactions, fail to see the value of things they brought with them. They also never follow the money. The Varakani tribe is clearly making money off the things they gather and sell, but they also seem to have all they need in their simple cliff dwellings. Failing to consider the larger economic system, taxes and tariffs and payments, the team misses important clues about the culture and how their actions might affect it. Spirituality. Although half of the explorers are Jesuits, they spend very little time considering the spiritual state of the inhabitants of Rakat. Before leaving Earth, Anne teases Emilio. "Whom do you think God loves best, Father?" "Ooh, there's a nasty little idea. Sentient rivalries. Think of the theology, Emilio." And yet, the Jesuits never have any spiritual conversations with the Runa or the Jana'ata, although they personally wrestle with questions of God's will and theodicy. Emilio explains later that the Runa have grammatical categories for things seen and unseen, and they have emotions, but seem to have no concept of a soul. On the other hand, the author's explanations of Jana'ata art, especially poetry and music, frequently refer to those things as touching the Jana'ata soul, even though the characters never explicitly bring this up. Conclusions. The Sparrow reveals that many of the challenges to mission in the past still exist today. Although we may now be more sensitive to the potential harm of expropriation, exploitation, and proselytizing, the potential harm of one culture simply encountering another remains. Without the explicit agenda of making converts or making money, mission must be guided by another goal in order to keep it on track. Without an ennobling guiding principle of both humanitarian and spiritual significance, it is dangerous and even hubris to assume that a cultural encounter will be only positive for both sides.